11 o'clock, according to my computer. And that's what I go by because that seems to work pretty much the best for me. So I'm Betsy Hill, president of Brainware Learning Company. I am so delighted that everybody's here today for our webinar. A few housekeeping things just as we're getting started. And it's just great to see people from all over the world, actually, certainly all over the US and Canada. We have some Brazil and Colombia. So housekeeping things. We are recording the webinar today, and so you will be able to access the recording later after it is processed. It typically takes about 24 hours for it to process. And everybody who is registered or who attended will automatically get an email when the recording is posted and available. So feel free when that happens to share it with your colleagues who maybe couldn't be here today or anybody you think would be interested. You had an opportunity to sign up for a certificate of participation when you registered for the webinar. If for some reason you didn't sign up at that point or aren't sure if you signed or want to, but do want to have a certificate of participation for professional development purposes, you can just send us an email. My email will be at the end. Also, you can send it to kbucola@mybrainware.com. And Judy Belk, it's always nice to see you. Finally, the slides can be downloaded as a handout. If you go to the handouts tab, they're available there and you can simply download it. So I think that is the housekeeping stuff. The next thing I want to do is just get a little bit of information on who we have in the webinar today. So I'm going to have a couple of polls that I'm going to open up. The first one is open now. And just wanted to know a little bit about our audience today. So if you could just, everybody seems to have found it without a problem. And of course you can check, it turns out you can check more than one, but we've got a lot of educational administrators today, so that makes a lot of sense. We're talking to a lot of principals and district level folks and heads of schools and things like that who are doing a lot of thinking today about STEM and social emotional learning, and it turns out that they fit pretty well together. All right, so about half are educational administrators, 43%. 31% are teachers. We've got some parents. Always love having you parents here. Some clinicians and 11% researchers. So thank you very much for doing that. That's not what I wanted to do. Okay, I want to close the poll. There, that's how I do it. Now, one more question. I wanted to know where everybody's priorities sit today. I know these are both pretty major topics, but I was just interested to see if there's a particular emphasis that people are experiencing today. All right, so this is very, very interesting. So far, it's looking like the significant majority are working on both equally, both STEM and SEL. And in terms of whether it's STEM as a priority or social and emotional learning as a priority, that is almost evenly split. 57% both STEM and SEL, and 21 or 22% on each of the others. So I'll give everybody just another couple of seconds to record their response if they want to do that. Looks like we're settling in there. All right, so very interesting. So what we're going to go ahead and get started now. And we're going to start with this. Here is an icon of today. It's a technology company well known for employing lots and lots of tech-savvy workers. And it is the inspiration in certain ways for this webinar, and before that for an article that I wrote for STEM magazine. And what triggered this was an article, you may have seen it, that appeared in the Washington Post describing 2 studies that Google did of its employees. And what they were really trying to do is to figure out what makes for a great Google employee. What kinds of skills have helped their employees be the most successful? What are the characteristics of the teams that are particularly effective? And what came out of these studies surprised some people. So on this slide and on the slides that you're downloading, you'll have a link where you can actually read the article that was written in the Washington Post. But the first 6 skills on the list of most important skills were not technical skills. It wasn't computer programming. It wasn't algorithms. It wasn't any of the other kinds of things that you might guess. They were what the newspaper article and many others might call soft skills. Communicating, having empathy and insight into others, critical thinking and problem solving. In the world of education, these are often referred to as 21st century skills. At least some of them are, and some of them are referred to more as social emotional skills. But a lot of discussion about these topics. So the importance of these skills may have been a revelation for Google. It certainly seemed to surprise that Washington Post writer. But it's what hiring managers have been saying for a long, long time across industries and around the country. So this is one where they were thinking about it as 21st century skills, but this information comes from a variety of places about workforce competencies. Are they ready to work, from the Conference Board? And it pretty much doesn't matter what list you look at. The same skills appear over and over on these lists. Critical thinking, problem solving, communication, interpersonal skills like collaboration and leadership. These continue to be the skills that organizations are looking for, and Google is not alone. But where does that leave STEM skills? Can it really be that a good coach, being a good coach, is more important at Google or some other technology company than programming ability? Is communication more of a priority than data analysis? Is understanding your colleagues of more value than writing a powerful algorithm? This seems to fly in the face of today's greater emphasis on STEM skills and the kinds of careers that we're hearing about, although it certainly supports the current focus in education on soft skills and social and emotional learning. And so this is what we're going to be exploring, of course, today. One of the reasons I think that people are surprised by the Google research results, Google study results, and sort of struggle with both of these concepts and holding them sort of independently, it has to do with mental models. We all have mental models about many things in the world. We have a mental model, for example, that the sun rises in the east. It's pretty clear why we have that one. We also have a mental model, say, of a teacher, although here our various models may look different. And we have mental models of STEM and mental models of SEL skills as well. So let's do a little thought experiment. Think of your mental model of a scientist. What first comes to mind? Now what comes to mind when you hear director of technology? Now think about your image of an engineer. And finally, think about your whatever comes to mind when you hear the word mathematician. Okay, so did your mental models resemble any of these? So we rationally know that our mental models are not fully representational of or representative of these fields, but our minds still build them, and there are good reasons for that. Mental models are a shortcut so that we don't have to rethink and reinvent everything all the time. So for example, we teach our children about strangers so that their mental models of people who don't know them, that they don't know, will keep them safe. But there are other mental models that may not be as useful. So for example, if you look at these images, you will probably notice that they have some things in common, one of which is that they're all men. And of course, we don't want that to be the image of somebody in a STEM career, but very often it is. What else do they have in common? Well, the people in these images seem to be technical experts. They also seem to be very task-focused. Social emotional competence doesn't really appear, or it's not readily apparent, except perhaps in the bottom left-hand image. We have two people. It looks like they're at least trying to communicate, whether or not they're very sensitive to each other's feelings or they're each other's backgrounds. You can't really tell very much. But let's try to do now the same thing for non-STEM or SEL skills. So now think in your mind what an image of communicating might look like. What would a picture look like about empathy? What about a couple of jobs that are not generally considered a STEM career? Let's say a teacher and a flight attendant. You got all those in your mind? Okay, well, here's some images I found. Does the top one resonate with your idea of communication? And the top right with your mental model of empathy? How about your mental model of teachers and flight attendants? So this may not be exactly what came to your mind when I raised those skills or suggested that you think about the two careers. But the idea is that our mental models of people with STEM skills and people with social emotional skills are generally rather different. And even when we try to abstract the skills, removing some of the implicit assumptions we've been making about age or gender and those kinds of things, we still have some feelings about the nature of work and skills required in different fields. So these are stock photographs, of course, as were the other ones. And so I don't know if these are their actual jobs, but it's a slide that I use in the MBA course I teach on strategic thinking when we talk about mental models. So this may not be exactly your mental model of an HR person or a CFO, but we still have that feeling that the skills for STEM careers and non-STEM careers are somehow different. Finance people or engineers need different skills than marketing and HR people, don't they? I think a lot of it boils down to our belief that you can think with your head, technically, analytically, scientifically, rationally, or you can think with your heart, emotionally, empathetically. And these are two different things requiring two different skill sets. So this is what we're going to explore today. I don't always save the agenda for slide 11, but I wanted to get everybody sort of in the mood of and raising your ideas and getting into your minds the way that we typically think about these skills and why it might be so difficult to, in fact, put them together. So we're going to dig into this today. We're going to dig into STEM skills. We're going to dig into social and emotional skills. And we're going to see what happens when we ground these in neuroscience. Okay, it looks like we've had a few people with some sound issues or other people. Just wanted to check, is everybody able to hear me right now? Hey, okay, sound issues. Yep, sound is fine. Okay, great. So we will just proceed. So it takes some effort, actually, to get down to a list of core skills for STEM. Most of the models that I found as I searched around sort of stop at dividing it up into its four component parts: science, technology, engineering, and math. But there must be some reason that we categorize these as STEM skills. So I know this is really small. It was really just to give you an idea of what some of the models are and some of the lists are that are out there. And so this one has things on it like mathematics, science. Okay, those seem pretty logical that you're going to include those in a list of math and STEM skills. But critical thinking, active learning, complex problem solving, operations analysis, technological design, equipment selection, programming. Okay, so these are more sort of the kinds of technical skills that we would expect. But it's, one of the reasons it's hard to do it is that there is so much diversity among those disciplines. For example, I read a really interesting, at least for me, I thought it was an interesting article the other day in which a physicist explained that his scientific discipline today is different from other scientific disciplines because it doesn't primarily depend on developing a hypothesis and then doing an experiment to prove or disprove it. Instead, it's about logically thinking through and doing mathematical calculations on how objects and forces behave. And in many cases, according to this physicist, there's currently really are no means to test the hypothesis. So it may be that somewhere way down the road, those techniques and that equipment and those whatever will be discovered and be able to test them. But today, it's really about that thought process and mathematical calculations. Whereas in other scientific fields, as many of you know, doing without a hypothesis would be just unthinkable, sort of like sliding down a ski jump on roller skates. But we do feel that STEM fields have something in common, and research has helped to identify some skills that appear to be particularly important in and characteristic of STEM disciplines. So these include the use of math, critical thinking, complex problem solving, systems analysis. So I think this list does a reasonable job of suggesting that there are some common themes in those skills. And indeed, all of those skills make sense when we consider the kinds of careers in what very few people would argue. I don't think people would argue about these being STEM careers. I think we can all agree that they're probably belong in that classification. This comes from geteducated.com, and it starts with, and actually they were termed best based on some research that they did into the growth in demand for these jobs, for people to fill these jobs, and the level of the compensation and the average salary. So petroleum engineering is at the very top, at least it was on this list. And computer engineering, actuarial science, biomedical engineering. Okay, I think we can imagine how math and critical thinking and problem solving are required in all of those careers. But the need for STEM skills is, I call it contagious. Remember that critical thinking and problem solving were not just for STEM occupations, they were on the list of the skills sought by employers across industries. And in fact, this trend is increasingly pronounced. There was an article in Forbes not long ago in which Anna Powers discussed 3 non-STEM fields. I hope you can see that my quotations in non-STEM, because obviously STEM skills in these were what she was saying was really indispensable. So one career she talked about is social media. Now, for sure, it doesn't require much in the way of technical skills or math to post something on Facebook. But social media as a career, just like just about any other career in marketing these days, is all about math. Calculating the cost per acquisition of a lead across different platforms or messages, creating a pro forma for a campaign. In fact, what is A/B testing if not hypothesis testing? And on from there. So I used a little bit of social media jargon in that discussion just to make the point, but these are all uses of math, uses of critical thinking, and uses of hypothesis testing in the case of the A/B testing. So if you're unfamiliar with those terms and you want more explanation, or you'd like to discuss it, I'd be happy to do that at some point. So just let me know. Another career that she talked about was data analysis, although it's really more of a skill, I think, because it's used so extensively for understanding and predicting consumer behavior, as well as performance on the baseball field or the basketball court. You may have read the 2003 book, Moneyball by Michael Lewis. In that book, it tells the story of a guy named Billy Beane, a former player who had become general manager of the Oakland Athletics. And he prioritized the use of statistics and data to make personnel decisions. His theory was that a team that got more players on base was a team more likely to score runs and as a result, more likely to win games. So completely based on statistics for players, he drafted and traded them for those who fit that system and only those players. And the result was that they were a team that drew far more walks than strikeouts. And it was an approach that actually turned out to work. The last field she talked about was artificial intelligence. And while we think of this as sometimes as being, robots with intelligence and things like that, there's a lot of human thinking also that goes into that. Every time you see other products suggested for you when you're on a website, or you wonder whether that automated voice on the phone is getting pretty conversational, think STEM. So these fields now demand STEM skills, and so do many others. In fact, I have been fascinated to come across a bunch of non-STEM fields that now pretty clearly require STEM skills. So we might not think of sociology as a STEM field, but how about astrosociology? It turns out that this is a field. It studies the reciprocal relationship between space exploration and society, culture, and human behavior. So for those of you like me who've not encountered that before, that's what it is all about. And I need to credit this. You can see the link down there. This came from STEM magazine, as do some of the other examples that are going to use. That's a great place to look for this kind of information. Or there's the chemistry of cosmetics, where you need to understand things like emulsions and emulsifiers. Ancient Greek women might also have been better off if they had understood that the lead carbonate they were using to have a paler complexion was actually poisonous. Or the culinary arts, which are increasingly becoming the culinary sciences, with the advent of innovations like molecular cuisine, also known as molecular gastronomy, for those of you who watch the Food Network. Technological innovations and experimental cuisine rely on STEM skills, as well as the artistry of delivering a beautifully composed plate of food. Or dietetics, or the law, here exemplified by a patent attorney. Or welding. Or even sports, as I alluded to earlier. Here, football for most of the world, soccer for those who think football involves quarterbacks and doesn't need goalies. In fact, the concept that STEM skills are essential for many, if not most careers, is being embraced by educators. This is a list of skills from We Are Teachers, and it reinforces the broad applicability of STEM skills and the need for them across a wide array of careers. Still, it is somewhat confusing because here we have skills like statistics and data-driven decision-making, but also creativity and flexibility, which many of us would probably associate with social and emotional intelligence, particularly that flexibility skill. So maybe we'll get a clearer perspective by looking at social and emotional skills. So we have been interested at Brainware Learning for some time in the skills that educators felt to be the most important SEL skills, social and emotional competence skills, in which were actually being tackled in schools. So this information is from a survey that we conducted earlier this year. On this list of skills, all but leadership were felt to be important by at least 50% of our respondents. And many are actually being addressed in formal or informal programs. That's what that when it says topic is addressed, that means it's could be a formal program. It could also be informal activities in the classroom. The one interesting mismatch between importance and whether the skill was included in the educational program was for relationship management. It was the top of the list in importance, but not being addressed by most informal or formal SEL programs. And there are a number of models for SEL, probably even more than for STEM. And so I'm just, for purposes of entertainment, I'm going to share a few. This model comes from NPR, and it simply emphasizes the confusion on the subject of social and emotional skills and the terminology that is being used. So I really am including this only for purposes of entertainment and to underscore the point that models that truly capture cause and effect are difficult to come by. So we know that grit doesn't cause agency, and we know that growth mindset, well, maybe it has something to do with resilience, but obviously this is not strictly a model that we could build an educational program on. Here's one from CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And it homes in on two dimensions. And here's where a theme emerges that I think we're going to see in some of the others. So one dimension is awareness versus management. So just being aware of something versus actually trying to affect it. The other dimension is self versus others. So is this awareness of myself or is it awareness of others? Is this management of myself or is this management of others? And then the action-oriented part of the model is decision-making and having a good basis for whatever action it is we are going to take. And this is intuitively appealing because the dimensions make sense and we feel like different processes are involved in them. This next model is from OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which many of you probably know is an international membership organization and shares research among nations. So here we see the self versus other, and the self versus other is reflected in the pink, open-mindedness, that obviously has to do with self, and the green, task performance, that's obviously something that the self does. The others are emotional regulation in red, and how that is going to, that could be part self-regulation, also self. And collaborative could be relationship management. That involves working with others. So interestingly, I thought this was interesting at least, the compound skills, which include critical thinking, metacognition, and self-efficacy, sort of hang off this chart by themselves, as if the people who developed this couldn't really figure out how to build them into that and how to connect it. So I've saved what I consider to be the best for last. This is a fairly recent model, and it comes out of work funded by the Wallace Foundation. I find this model, especially the center part of it, particularly useful. And so just in case you're having trouble reading it, social, emotional skills, and behavior at the very center. And then there are 3 pie pieces around it: emotional processes, social and interpersonal skills, and cognitive regulation. And the reason I find this useful is it connects most directly to the nature of the skills themselves and the neuroscience behind them. And that's what I want to focus on next. Somewhere among all these models and concepts, there really is a connection. When you look at this model and see cognitive regulation, emotional processes, and social interpersonal processes, we can readily see the concepts of self versus others that seem to be there. But we're getting a clear acknowledgement of the brain's role in regulation and emotional processes. And interesting, none of the other models uses the word emotional in the characterization of social and emotional competence. So we're seeing a couple of aspects. One is the aspect of cognitive regulation. The other is the aspect of emotion. So we're going to take a little deeper look at these pie pieces and see what we can come up with. So this is how the study characterizes each of those three components, or those pie pieces. At the root of managing ourselves and our relationships is the idea of cognitive regulation. And this really aligns with the neuroscience research, where it's called executive functions. So it talks about attentional control, inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And then we have to acknowledge, of course, that there are emotional processes, and that we need to recognize that they're sometimes occurring in the context of social and emotional relationships. When I talk with educators around the country, most are familiar with the term executive functions, and they know they're important, but they mostly can't define them, and very few are clear on how to develop them. But if these are the underlying processes that are essential for the various behaviors that we recognize as SEL, then they are worth understanding. And we'll see that we're going to use a model that I have been working on, we have been working on for a number of years now. This is just part of it. We're going to share a little bit more of it. But I wanted to start with this part of the model first, because I want to focus on executive functions, particularly those that are considered to be the core executive functions. Here they are, sort of sandwiched in between the bottom tier, which is foundational cognitive skills. These are the foundational cognitive skills, are the basic ways that our brains take in from the outside world. They include visual processing, processing speed, sequential processing, auditory processing, sequential processing. So these happen non-consciously at pretty much an automatic level. So if they're functioning accurately and efficiently, that is, which they're not always. But so those are the non-conscious. When we get up to the level of core executive functions, then they start to become conscious. They're the way that our minds manage what we think about and react, and are the control or regulatory aspects of our mental processes. So here are the three core executive functions: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. So working memory, just to reinforce this, many of you may know this, the ability to hold information in our minds while we manipulate it. So it's our primary conscious processing, really our only conscious processing. Inhibitory control, pretty much what it sounds like, is the ability to suppress an action or thought, or to refrain from doing something we might otherwise do, both in the short term and as well over time. So if you think about deferring gratification, that's an example also of inhibitory control. And then cognitive flexibility is how we adjust our mindset when the rules of the world around us change. So we think of other words that we use to describe people, like adaptability, as well as flexibility. And so what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit and to see if we could think up some examples of how our brains use these executive functions in a STEM context and in an SEL context. Because if they are involved in both, that can be pretty illuminating. And they could actually account for why we seem to see that overlap in certain kinds of skills between STEM and SEL. We should be able to create scenarios on how they would operate, and that's what I've tried to do here. So if we take working memory, a STEM example of that would be doing a complex math problem or other kind of engineering problem and holding a bunch of different factors or aspects, components of the problem in our mind while we are thinking about it, or in a multiple step solution in a math problem, keeping track of where we are in those multiple steps. In an SEL example, we also need to hold information in our minds while we're engaging with others. We might need to be holding someone else's point of view in mind and comparing and contrasting it to other points of view. Let's think about inhibitory control now. All right, engineering. Not leaping to that first possible solution, but questioning assumptions and considering other alternatives. Pretty important there. In the social and emotional context, I always love this example, not blowing out the candles on someone else's birthday cake, not blurting out, "That's stupid," when you disagree with somebody, not punching them in the nose. Okay, so we seem to use those in both domains. How about cognitive flexibility? When we have to look at problems from different points of view and being able to change direction on the basis of new information. So when the world discovered that the earth is not flat, when the limitations of Newton's laws were understood and the theory of relativity, and even the limitations of that, we have to really change how we think about the world and how it operates. And we have to do that from a personal point of view as well as from a social and emotional point of view. We need to look at our personal experiences from different points of view. We might need to be able to change direction on the basis of new information. Maybe we find out that that person that we thought was just not a very nice person is very shy. And understanding that in that different point of view, we're going to think very differently and behave differently and able to be able to make that adjustment. So there is a common neuroscience underpinning for these skills that seem to have been so confusing, and that underpinning is executive functions. But I think we still have one stumbling block to address, and I want to get into that now. So we talked about the need for STEM skills across careers and disciplines. We've talked about the need for SEL skill across careers and disciplines. Some of them seem to overlap, but can we get away from the divide between head and heart? Maybe the underlying mechanisms are the same, but the domains are different. We couldn't exclude that based on what we were just talking about. Is it just that most careers need both types of skills, or is there truly the kind of common underpinning that the discussion of executive functions suggests? So here's where we need to do a little bit more neuroscience. And this part of the story starts with a guy named Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a construction foreman working on the railways in the mid-1800s. And one day, working with dynamite, there was an explosion and a tamping bar blasted up through the top of his head. Quite remarkably, he survived, and in most respects recovered. His intelligence, his speech, his movement were the same, but his behavior changed completely. He became unreliable and easily angered when someone told him he couldn't do something he wanted to do. His emotions were quite literally out of control. At the time, the field of medicine had very little to offer by way of explanation. But since then, neuroscience has been able to identify parts of the brain responsible for working together to enable our conscious decision-making process and our emotions to collaborate and work together. And the part of his brain that was damaged was the ability to actually control, use that inhibitory control among other executive functions. So this picture of a brain is where the battle between the head and the heart goes on, between rational and emotional behavior. But it's not really a battle, as it turns out. It is a perfect match for thinking and decision-making. So in this diagram, it's just half of a brain as if we had sliced it right down the middle, and we're looking just at one hemisphere. Remember that there's another one that has the same components in it. So that's why we talk about frontal lobes, which you can see in this image. The front of our brain is on the left and the back of our brain is on the right. And the frontal lobes, of course, makes sense, are on the front. And this is the seat of executive functions. This is the part of the brain, at least in the cortex, that is the covering of the brain, which is responsible for making decisions, for planning, for controlling our emotions, for regulating things. It's where all of those executive functions happen. And the structures underneath it are where the emotions largely happen. And this, you probably may have heard of parts of the brain in the limbic system. You may have heard the term limbic system, with the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. And all of these are in general referred to as the limbic system. It's the part of the brain that's really responsible for emotions. So we need to balance and coordinate between these two areas, and that's what allows us to make effective decisions. So your frontal lobes listen to your emotions and mediate them and assess the value of your emotional self and the value that that emotional self assigns to different options in order to choose. So the trigger for much of this emotional response is that little almond-shaped piece called the amygdala. You can see that little bit right in there. So if your frontal lobes are immature or damaged, decisions may be problematic, or you might have difficulty making a decision at all, like Phineas Gage. And there are many other examples. There's a guy named Elliot, which is not his real name because he's still alive, and the psychologists and other neuroscience researchers don't reveal people's real names until after their life has ended. So he had a good job, was a good husband, got along, but he got a brain tumor, which was diagnosed in the frontal lobe of his brain, and you can probably guess what happened. So he had to remove it, and they had to remove some brain tissue with it. Intelligence, speech, perception, memory, all intact, but he could not plan or decide. His life fell apart. He could think up lots of options to any problem, but he was unable to decide between them because his frontal lobes could no longer determine the value of different options as conveyed by the emotional part of his brain. And if you're starting to get an inkling that good decisions can't be made without our emotional system, then you're getting the point. So we know how important our frontal lobes are in decision making. There's been actually quite a lot of discussion about that in all of the materials that are used to help teachers understand parts of the brain and what their function is. We talk about the immaturity of the frontal lobe until we're into our 20s as being part of the reason that teens are risk takers and all that kind of thing. But it also turns out that damage to the part of the brain that processes emotions can have a similar effect. So here's an experiment that was performed with individuals, well, normal individuals, and also those with damage to the amygdala, that little part of the brain that signals emotion, particularly danger. So this is called the Iowa card sort test. So hello to those of you from Iowa. In this test, the subjects are presented with different decks. Some are blue, some are red. Each card has a monetary outcome on it, and the subjects are told that some of the decks are good and some are bad, but they don't know which is which. So they draw cards for a set number of turns, deciding which deck to take a card from. The good deck, here I've labeled them, but obviously the subjects are not seeing that, is the red deck, which is on average, if you get a good card, it's $50, and 10% of the cards, so 90% of the cards are $50 gain, and 10% of the cards represent a $250 loss. So if you drew 10 cards randomly from the deck, you would average a gain of $250. So that would be a good deck. The bad decks have a higher average gain per card, but they are also more risky because the amount of losing cards is greater. So you can have a $100 gain, but you're going to get more losing cards, and therefore it's a bad deck because on average you're going to have a $250 loss if you continue to draw from that deck. So normal subjects, even if they can't articulate why, and they haven't figured out exactly what's happening, tend to gravitate to the good decks over time. And you can see that in this graph. So you're having a net score, and the normal control group is the blue line, whereas they're losing some at the beginning, but they begin to figure out and they begin to be able to identify those more favorable decks, and they persist in that behavior. On the contrary, the subjects who have an amygdala lesion or have a damage to the amygdala in their brains sort of get the idea for a while until they get up to sort of even Steven, but then they fall back again. So what's happening is their bodies aren't signaling them about the risk involved in their behavior. They fail to use their prior emotional history to regulate their current behavior. So normal individuals get good at figuring out which the good decks are and sticking with them. But the other individuals, those with damage to the emotional part of the brain, aren't getting those signals. So the interplay between emotion and rationality is critical in decision making. You can't eliminate either one. If you aren't incorporating emotion, you literally can't fall off the fence one way or the other. But also, if you can't regulate or observe your process, you're likely to engage in very risky and damaging behavior, or simply be unable to decide at all. So this is something I think a lot of people find surprising. One of the ways that I started to think about it when I first encountered this research and started to think about decision making, because we all like to think that we're rational decision making, and in fact we are rational decision makers, but it's our emotional history that allows us to make good and rational and sound decisions. And one of the things that I started to reflect on is, if decision making was all a matter of analytics and rationality, how do you know what outcome is desirable unless you can experience desire? Unless you want something, unless you have some emotion attached to it, it's hard to choose. And I think about some of the things that we talk about in one of my MBA courses. We often use an example of diamonds. And it's an interesting industry and has an interesting history that lets us look at some aspects of competition and strategy. But one of the things that we also typically observe is that there is nothing inherently valuable about a diamond unless you're trying to cut another diamond. The value that we place on it is purely something that has been built up by our culture and its associations with love and commitment and all of those kinds of things. So it triggers those emotional responses, and that's why we find it desirable. So what our brains are actually trying to do is to make sense of this world that is somewhat arbitrary, that doesn't have predetermined values set to things like rocks that happen to be able to be cut into pretty stones for rings. But we do that to be able to make choices and to have that interplay between our intellect, our rational decision-making system, and our emotions that actually operate together. So what I wanted to do is come back to that cognitive skills model. And I've added a couple of layers to what we were looking at just in terms of cognitive skills and executive functions. So at the top is where we want all of our students and children to get. Academically, we want them to get as far as they can and want to. We want them to achieve at the most important level that they can, at the best level that they can. We want them to have a good job and make money that will support them and their families, and a career that will be satisfying and interesting for them. We want them to be healthy. We want them to stay out of jail. All of these kinds of things are at the very top. And what we're now focusing on in schools is not just the English language arts, sort of the softer side of SEERS, if you will, and the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math, but where they connect in the middle with social emotional learning. And as we saw, those skills are part and parcel of learning, whether it's STEM, turns out the same skills apply. We only have one brain after all, for reading and for math. And that all of these sit on top of that cognitive infrastructure that we looked at before. In fact, if we dissect the skills needed to read, we would find they're just as dependent on executive functions and foundational cognitive skills as the STEM competencies that we talked about earlier. So all of this really hangs together. So what would it mean if we could actually measure and develop a student's core executive functions? One of the things I didn't say and that I meant to is that, as you might expect, the research has been showing that the level of development of an individual's executive functions is highly correlated with everything at the top. So not only is it predictive of social emotional learning, not only does it predict STEM expertise, not only is it integral in reading, but your long-term educational attainment, how much money you're going to make over your career, how healthy you are, and in fact, even whether you're going to end up in jail, are all correlated with executive functions. And so this is where we actually know that we can have an impact. It is possible to develop executive functions, particularly those core executive functions, and we can just imagine what that would entail. We're not going to have time to talk about that in detail today, but we have worked on other webinars and other places where we talk about tools to measure and to develop executive functions. And I'd be happy to talk about that some more individually with anybody, or we're probably going to do another webinar on that as well. But I just wanted to focus on some conclusions, some takeaways from today. So emotions, when we talk about social emotional regulation, we talk about STEM. Emotions are not just messy toddlers in a china shop. I have a 1-year-old granddaughter, and I just can't imagine what that would look like because she is walking now. But there's essential supports for decision-making and rational behavior, as are our executive functions. The very neurobiological systems that support emotional functioning in social interactions also support decision-making in general. So social behavior is a specific instance of decision-making that calls on those neurobiological systems. So is deductive reasoning. So are other kinds of reasoning. So the cognitive processes that need to be developed for STEM also serve SEL and vice versa. So as I said, we're going to plan on holding a webinar at some point on measuring and developing executive functions. In the interim, if you would like to receive some information, I'm going to use a tool, if I can find it, that's part of this platform that I have not previously tried. So this is an experiment. My hypothesis is that this will be helpful, but we're going to find out. Okay, so send offer. All right. So if anybody would like to schedule some time to engage in some conversation and talk about your specific situation and how you might find some tools that would enable you to measure and develop executive functions, you can just click on this. Now, I can't tell if you can see it. Hopefully, that has been done. Karen, did that work? Okay, cool. All right, awesome. So we have just a few minutes left, about 7 minutes before our stopping time. I would be delighted to answer any questions that anybody has. And I'm going to scroll back. What does that look like for special education students? For example, a student with TBI. How do you work around that, and what are some supports? Okay, so Tara, that is a really great question. So in special education, you're going to find lots of different things, of course. One of the largest groups of students within special education is students with specific learning disabilities, who by definition have deficits in some of less well-developed areas of cognitive processing, particularly executive functions. And very often you will see deficits, particularly in working memory, attention, and other aspects of cognitive processing. And that is also going to be true for many students with TBI, although TBI can affect a lot of different parts of the brain. So it's a little bit more difficult to generalize about that. In our work, what we have seen is the ability to remediate, to actually develop those underlying cognitive processes very close to almost closing the gap between what would be considered normally developing and where the students start on average. So for many students, as in addition to the kinds of accommodations and other supports that we provide them, we can actually help remediate those underlying skills. So I will make a note and send you some more information on that. All right, now I'm going to look. The same would be true for children and adults with sensory processing issues. Those are may require some work on some of the specific sensory issues, but the integration in with other skills is something. We're getting a whole bunch of great books. Yes, I would be happy to do that. Looks like we're getting a bunch of great books here. So Asperger, that's a great question also about Asperger's, and I am not an expert on autism. Based on what I have read, my understanding is that autism often involves the connection between the rational and the emotional systems. And so I don't know if, to my knowledge, there has not been work to completely remediate that, although maybe somebody knows of that. But there is a lot of work that is being done to help people with Asperger's and other high-functioning autism to integrate those skills better than they do without that kind of support. Oh my gosh, I love that, Terry. A calculus teacher allocates some time at the end of his brain crunching analytical sessions, and they throw a ball and take turns answering SEL questions. I think that's a great thing to do. So the first place in any activity to teach social and emotional learning to our kids, the place to me to start is with the actual training of those underlying cognitive processes. And then when those children have those processes, those mental processes, those connections in their brain working effectively, then to start to, and there are a bunch of good SEL programs out there that you can use. I think people have mentioned a couple of them, and explaining how those skills are played out in, for example, one of the things that I know a lot of teachers do who have had some background in how the brain functions is that they actually teach their students about the emotional part of the brain, and that when they are feeling anxious or when they're feeling afraid, when they're feeling really stressed, they are very emotional, and they actually call it, I'm now in my amygdala. And so giving them a name for it, giving them something to call it, helping them understand what's going on is something. So that would be a great activity to do with kids in classrooms. And you're right, Edutopia also has a bunch of those. Okay, click on handouts, yes. Learning additional languages and cultures, absolutely. There actually is cognitive value to learning other languages. If you learn them early, you can learn them basically the same way that you did your native language. And the same parts of the brain actually are used to produce language. Cultures are wonderful for understanding or for developing cognitive flexibility, understanding how other people think, seeing things from different points of view. It looks like we're getting, one of the things that I will do is, it looks like there's a lot of suggestions for various types of programs that people have experience with. And what I will do is I will call those from the chat log. And that will, I'll try to put those into a summary for everybody and send it out with the follow-up information. So just before we finish up, I wanted to provide my contact information. This is how you get in hold. This is a synapse. These are two neurons connecting together and sending messages back and forth. So I think it's a wonderful way to think about our ability to stay connected and to build stronger relationships with each other. I really want to thank everybody for participating today. Again, you'll get a link to the recording of the webinar when it's ready. I'm also going to compile a list of programs that people suggested and many of these wonderful links that people are sharing, and that will be sent out. That will probably be separate from the initial automated email that you get when the presentation is ready. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a great day, and use those great underlying cognitive skills and executive functions, both in your good decision making, in your STEM career, and in your social and emotional relationships. Thanks so much and have a great day.